Welcome to the deep dive, where we don't just, summarize the news. We take a huge stack of sources,
Yeah.
articles, personal notes, psychological profiles, and really wrestle with them to pull out the key insights, the surprising bits of knowledge, so you don't have to.
And today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most stressful environments you can possibly imagine. We're talking about a junior academic who is just desperately trying to survive his social obligations.
Right.
Our subject is James Dixon, a man fighting tooth and nail for tenure, but he's not fighting against intellectual heavyweights. He's fighting against sheer professional pretense and these just unbearable social demands.
That sounds almost universal, really. Just, amplified by tweed jackets and sherry. So our mission today is to use this whole saga of Dixon's battle for a job renewal as a practical field guide, maybe a cautionary one.
Definitely cautionary.
We're going to extract the survival strategies and, of course, the spectacular self-destructive failures from a man whose internal life is just defined by this deep, corrosive mix of anxiety and cynicism.
We've got a really comprehensive set of sources on this. They detail his professional compromises, his romantic entanglements, and his eventual, and I'd say glorious, public breakdown.
Glorious is a good word for it.
And Dixon himself gives us this immediate insight into the huge psychological cost of just existing in this world. When he's trapped, when he's forced to be civil, his internal coping mechanism just kicks right in.
Yeah, tell us about that.
He describes it as plotting internally to cause, and this is a quote, a deep, dangerous flush to suffuse his face, or he'll draw his lower lip under his top teeth.
That is such a classic physical sign of someone trying to keep a lid on explosive stress.
Yeah.
It's not about expressing himself, is it? It's about self-containment.
Exactly.
Using these little physical acts to stop the real, honest fury from just, bursting out. It's the armor of politeness.
That's a perfect way to put it. He's constantly managing his own body language to convey an interest or a respect that he absolutely does not feel. And speaking of the source of all this agony, the immediate professional threat is, of course, Professor Welch. Ah, Welch.
The head of the department. The man who holds Dixon's entire future in his hands.
And Welch is just a masterclass in petty tyranny. Our sources make it so clear that he insists on the title professor with a kind of zeal that suggests he thinks it's the only thing validating his whole existence.
Right. And he sets the tone for the entire department by just constantly holding forth on trivialities. I mean, he spends endless minutes distinguishing between a flute and a recorder.
Which, as we are solemnly informed,
the flute's immediate ancestor, yes.
It's not about deep scholarship, is it? It's about setting up a hierarchy of this arcane, socially mandatory knowledge.
That's it, exactly. If you don't participate in the discussion about the recorder's ancestry, you're immediately marked as, culturally unfit.
Yeah.
Welch weaponizes the tiny details of culture to exert control over everyone beneath him, and that control completely defines Dixon's existence. Okay, let's unpack this whole miserable situation. We need to get into the core institutional critique in Section 1, the academic maze and the cost of survival. Let's start with a specific pressure point that defines Dixon's daily anxiety.
Well, the sharp, persistent stress of Dixon's post, it all revolves around precarity. His professional survival hinges on an almost absurdly specific requirement.
Which is?
Getting his article accepted by a learned journal within a single month. That deadline, combined with the power dynamic, just creates this crushing environment for him.
And what makes this so insidious is Welch is explicit. Well, he disqualifies himself, doesn't he? He's absolutely clear that he lacks the specialized knowledge to judge the article's intellectual merit.
Yes, he says it openly. I can't tell, can I, what it's worth? And that right there is the critical insight into the system Dixon is trapped in.
Merit doesn't matter.
Merit, in this specific academic pocket, is subjective, and ultimately it's just ignored by the department head. The only metric that counts is external institutional validation. Welch needs, and he kind of stammers it out, an acceptance by a learned journal would, because he cannot, or maybe he just will not, rely on his own academic judgment.
So the system prioritizes this measurable, publishable output, probably regardless of quality, just for the sake of ticking a box that, I guess, preserves the institution's image.
Precisely. Dixon's goal isn't scholarly excellence, it's bureaucratic expediency. He just has to find the fastest way to get a rubber stamp on a piece of work that his own boss admits he can't even assess.
Wow, and that anxiety is just amplified by this constant need for self-protection against Welch's own shortcomings.
His cognitive shortcomings, yes. Dixon has to constantly monitor Welch's memory lapses and his his strategic forgetfulness.
He describes needing to bawl out previous explanations he's given just to remind Welch of prior decisions or agreements.
And if he doesn't do that, Welch might just arbitrarily forget a previous conversation and make a decision that immediately torpedoes Dixon's entire career path.
Which means Dixon's brain is always split. Part of it is dedicated to his actual work, and a huge part is just dedicated to managing his boss's erratic memory.
And that managerial labor is only the beginning. We have to factor in the massive amount of unpaid administrative and social labor Dixon performs just to appease his superior and, earn a bit of political capital.
The sources show he's basically blackmailed into glancing through proofs for Welch's Antiquities articles.
And that phrase, glancing through, that is the quintessential academic euphemism, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It translates directly to doing the tedious, detailed, often embarrassing heavy lifting that I, the senior professor, am too distracted or incapable or maybe just too lazy to perform myself. Dixon has to correct the entire manuscript, all under the guise of it being a casual favor.
And the obligations just spiral out from professional correction into cultural servitude. The sources note his need to hold himself ready for duties as ridiculous as attending a folk dancing conference on demand.
That just shows that the cultural requirements of the job are as burdensome and non-negotiable as the professional ones. You aren't just required to teach, you have to be a fully compliant participant in Welch's preferred version of cultural life.
This constant precarity dictates his behavior everywhere, even when he's supposedly just doing his teaching duties, right? Specifically with this special subject he's been assigned.
Yes. It was Welch's idea, of course, but Dixon's focus isn't on pedagogy. It's on this acute political maneuvering around student enrollment.
Okay, let's detail that maneuver, because it perfectly encapsulates the distance between the academic ideal and the administrative reality.
For sure. The sources show Dixon plotting to secure the 3 prettiest girls for his class while strategically excluding another student, Michie.
And Michie, ironically, happens to be dating one of those girls.
Which makes it even more political. See, Dixon has to manage the class size very carefully. A class of 3 is small enough that it won't compete directly with Welch's own special subject. That would definitely incur resentment, maybe even professional rivalry.
But securing the prettiest girls is a morale boost for him, a subtle sign of status.
Right. He's optimizing for the lowest possible political risk and the highest personal consolation. It just confirms that his academic survival is completely divorced from intellectual merit or pedagogical excellence. He's not a teacher. He's a social engineer.
It sounds utterly, completely exhausting. This constant forced civility, the need to monitor and correct and politically calculate every single move, it must drive this deep wedge between his exterior compliance and his violent interior life.
That is the core psychological split. We see the stunning contrast between his outward smiles and these intense fantasies of anarchic fury. This is his only true release valve.
And these fantasies they're graphic. While he's riding in Welch's car, having to deal with the professor's clumsy gear changes and his endless irritating monologue, Dixon is mentally plotting this grotesque, ritualistic violence.
He mentally promises himself he'd seize Welch, expel the breath from his furry gray-blue waistcoat, and then the image becomes profoundly specific and disgusting.
Yeah.
He wants to plunge the 2 small feet and their capless shoes into a lavatory basin, pulling the plug once, twice, and again stuffing the mouth with toilet paper.
I mean, what does it tell us about the sheer psychological containment required by this world? That his only release is imagining this grotesque, ritualistic violence against Welch?
It's not just anger. It's an act of mental self-preservation against being completely consumed by the pettiness of his environment.
He's trying to stay sane.
It's the ultimate expression of resentment for forced politeness. Dixon is so constrained by the social contract that he has to dream up these fantasies of total degradation, of restoring some kind of order by utterly annihilating Welch's physical and cultural composure.
The imagery is so specific. The small feet, the toilet paper. It's about reducing Welch from the elevated professor to just a sputtering, helpless, small animal.
And the cost of this dual life is visible on his face. The strain of maintaining that interested facade on the car ride is noted explicitly. His face becomes creased and flabby like an old bag.
He's constantly steering between a collapse into helpless fatigue and a tautening with anarchic fury.
This dual existence, the polite academic puppet on one hand, and the seething nihilist on the other. That's his central psychological reality. The fury is the energy that keeps him from collapsing into total apathetic fatigue. He's using his resentment as fuel. just to survive.
And having seen how he handles the professional pressure from Welch, we now have to look at how he manages the equally draining pressure of his personal life. Which brings us to Section 2, the Margaret business, the nexus of guilt and obligation that threatens to just swallow Dixon whole.
Margaret Peel. She represents the social contract gone toxic. And it is so essential to understand that Dixon was not trapped by mutual romantic interest or passion. Not at all.
Yeah.
He was trapped by his own fundamental human decency. A combination of, and the sources list them out, politeness, friendly interest, ordinary concern, a good-natured willingness to be imposed upon, a desire for unequivocal friendship.
So his virtues became his cage. It started so innocently. A civil coffee invitation, a basic sign of friendliness. But through this kind of insidious escalation, fueled by his inability to set boundaries, he quickly went from just an acquaintance to the man who was going around with Margaret.
And the situation solidified dramatically when the rival suitor, a man named Catchpole, effectively threw her right over onto his lap.
Wow.
Dixon just inherited all the emotional debris and the burden of her crisis. His fate became absorbing her, quote, unmanning questions and confessions.
This is such a devastating mechanism for you, the listener, to consider. If you are a naturally decent, accommodating person, your own kindness can be weaponized against you. Dixon's basic reluctance to say a strong no, or to inflict what he perceives as emotional harm, it leads to this spiraling forced commitment that just drains him completely.
And the ultimate expression of this forced commitment arrives with Margaret's recovery from her suicide attempt. She used sleeping pills. And Dixon is forced into the role of devoted caretaker and primary confidant during her convalescence.
And she recounts the whole incident in this really unsettling detail. She was terrified they'd tell the police. But she praises the hospital staff for being angelic.
It's like she's treating a catastrophic personal crisis as a slightly inconvenient adventure. She's focused on the mundane details of the administration and the care.
But what is truly strange, and what really should have raised some red flags for Dixon, is her motivation.
Yes, she describes wanting some kind of noise going on as she was going off because the room was horribly quiet.
That one detail, it elevates the event from genuine tragedy to something almost pathological. It suggests the attempt wasn't primarily about the despair of losing Catchpole.
No, it was about avoiding silence or loneliness, needing a dramatic backdrop, a theatrical production for her own transition. It implies this deep need for constant external validation and attention.
But Dixon, of course, is still trapped in the cultural script of the devoted caretaker. He has to face the necessary, dreadful, last compulsory question.
He has to ask her if she would have another shot at it.
And her reply is just utterly devoid of emotion, which should have been another huge clue for Dixon. She says, I don't care about him anymore. I don't feel anything at all about him, one way or the other.
That neutrality is chilling. It just confirms she's detached, capable of viewing her own life or death crisis with this clinical distance.
But despite the intellectual strangeness of her story, the emotional entanglement is already just too deep for him.
Yes, the sources emphasize that Margaret is already fixed too firmly in his life and his emotions to be pushed out of them by a mere recital of facts. He feels the guilt, regardless of what the truth might be.
Which brings us to the ultimate recital of facts.
Yeah.
The Catchpole theory. A dose of cold, hard reality delivered by the rival suitor himself.
Catchpole reappears later. Maybe he's feeling a pang of residual guilt, or maybe he just needs to assert his own non-culpability. And he introduces the critical detail that changes everything for Dixon, at least intellectually.
And what is that detail?
Catchpole reveals that Margaret only took one bottle of pills, despite having two readily available and easily accessible.
Oh. So the implication, which Catchpole sees as confirmation of his own shrewdness, is that the attempt was calculated. It was designed to be non-lethal.
A manipulative performance, yes. Designed to secure attention and pity. Catchpole believes her actions were consciously calculated to throw her right over onto Dixon's lap.
This is the intellectual truth Dixon needed. It's the moment the light finally switches on for him. Catchpole's theory lets Dixon realize that Margaret's actions were deliberate and manipulative, not genuinely suicidal in intent.
He understands with this cold clarity that he was strategically chosen to inherit her drama.
But here is the profound psychological gap. Dixon has the truth. He had the intellectual freedom provided by Catchpole's theory, yet he remains emotionally bound by his own decency.
The knowledge that she manipulated him using his own virtues, it's a powerful weapon, but the emotional entanglement is so deep that this mere recital of facts is not enough to free him. He is still hostage to the feeling of guilt, even when he has factual proof the guilt was manufactured for his own consumption.
This struggle between the intellectual truth and the emotional burden is the defining conflict of his personal life. He knows he's being manipulated now, but he hasn't yet found the courage or the chaotic energy required to act on that knowledge.
And before that freedom can arrive, he must endure a completely different kind of torture. Which brings us to Section 3, the social minefield, Welch's arty weekend.
This weekend is designed as pure cultural torture. It's a perfect, agonizing crystallization of the forced pretense that Dixon despises in academia. It is a mandatory performance of high culture.
And Margaret, with a stunning moment of clarity despite all her other issues, recognizes the sheer dreadfulness of it. She's the one who names the mandatory gathering. She calls it the tinkle of tiny silver bells laugh.
That's perfect, and the program Welch lays out, it just confirms the utter nightmare of forced cultural appreciation. The schedule is packed.
It is. We've got part songs, a play reading in French, ennui of course, sword dance stacks, recitations, and a chamber concert. Dixon is facing a calendar of sheer, concentrated cultural obligation that is just testing his sanity.
And what's fascinating here is the external professional angling going on. This isn't just a private get-together.
Not at all. The presence of a chap from the third program and a camera team from Picture Post reveals Welch's real ambition.
He's trying to use this amateur-strained weekend as professional fodder. He's angling for an article or a radio talk on the provincial culture group.
He's hoping to turn his own social anxieties and amateur chaos into self-promotion and institutional credibility. Dixon isn't just a guest, he's a required extra in Welch's play for relevance.
And Dixon is forced into this cultural servitude most excruciatingly during the participation in madrigals. He gets assigned the unsported tenor part.
Which means he's highly exposed. And he describes his internal agony when Goldsmith, who is the main tenor, loses his place. It leaves Dixon exposed and completely silent, just flapping his mouth uselessly.
His humiliation is acute.
And his cynicism immediately kicks in. He laments internally, why hadn't they had the decency to ask him if he'd like to join in? Which is a rhetorical question that speaks to the fundamental lack of consideration for junior staff. Everything is imposed, nothing is ever requested.
This forced participation just confirms Dixon's deepest paranoia. He fears Welch wants to test my reactions to culture, see whether I'm a fit person to teach in a university. All because he committed the cardinal sin of admitting he can't tell a flute from a recorder.
His intellectual capacity is completely irrelevant. His cultural compliance is paramount. If he fails the culture test, the job is gone. So how does Dixon cope with this overwhelming cultural imposition?
Through a perfect, petty, physical act of resistance.
Yes.
The cocktail onions. The sources highlight that in silent defiance against this overwhelming pretension, Dixon consumes 7 or 8 cocktail onions.
It is the ultimate passive-aggressive protest. It's silent, it's slightly rude, it impacts his breath, and it gives him this purely internal satisfaction of undermining the preciousness of the event. He is poisoning his own social performance just enough to preserve his sanity, a small, pungent victory that no one else can appreciate or condemn.
The weekend also forces us to analyze the strange supporting cast that orbits the Welch planet. Let's start with the sons.
We meet Michel, the effeminate writer, and Bertrand, the bearded pacifist painter. And his artistry includes this massive nude painting that's prominently displayed titled Amateur Model.
So these sons are extensions of Welch's own artistic pretension. They offer him fodder for discussion and a way to demonstrate their inherited cultural superiority.
And then there is the figure of Evan Johns, the oboist and office worker.
Yeah.
And he is chillingly described as a silent mover, a potential eavesdropper, and a friend of the Welches.
That descriptor alone marks him as the precise social danger Dixon should be wary of. He's the quiet, observant functionary.
The one who takes notes on social infractions and reports back to the power center. He is the perfect informant in this closed system.
And the entire environment is constantly reinforcing Welch's oppressive presence, particularly through his passion for music.
Oh, yes. We see Dixon suffering through Welch's insistence on listening to a long, excruciatingly boring piano concerto rondo. Lacking the ability to leave or scream, Dixon deploys his intellectual defense mechanism again. He mentally translates the rondo into a string of increasingly vulgar, creative swear words just to cope with the musical torture.
And we should appreciate the artistry of his internal monologue here. He listens to the music and processes it as, "You ignorant clod, you stupid old sod, you wordy old turdy old scum, you gripping old piping old bump."
It's his way of turning high culture into low comedy. He's performing a mental act of desecration against the very thing Welch values most. This internal verbal violence is Dixon's last line of defense against being fully assimilated by the Welch's suffocating pretense. He survives by mentally reducing his tormentors to crude rhymes.
The pressure cooker of professional anxiety, toxic obligation, and cultural torture finally explodes in Section 4. The Chaos Campaign burnt beds, stolen taxes, and new alliances.
Dixon finally finds a moment of respite after escaping the arty party for a local pub. And he realizes, crucially, that pubs in this specific county stay open until 10:30 in the summer, unlike in the city.
A sliver of freedom.
A sliver of freedom that results in a massive loss of sobriety and property.
He returns drunk, collapses onto the bed, and triggers the incendiary incident. A dropped cigarette results in massive structural damage.
Burnt holes in the sheet, the blankets, the rug, and the bedside table. This is physical, undeniable evidence of his lack of control and his disrespect for his host's hospitality.
His response, however, is magnificent in its desperation and its attention to detail. This is where Dixon, the cynical planner, really shines. He has to hide the damage immediately.
And we need to detail the extent of this cover-up because it is an act of sheer criminal genius. He uses a razor blade to carefully cut the edges of the holes smooth. Then he meticulously shaves the burned part of the rug to remove the evidence of charring.
Then comes the ingenious rationale for deception. He decides he needs to rough up the jagged edges later so the damage looks less like human error and more like
fulminant dry rot or the ravages of a colony of moths. He is framing his crime as a natural disaster.
That is true dedication to deception. It's an almost academic level of research into pathology, the pathology of neglect versus the pathology of accident. But he realizes he can't manage this campaign of chaos and concealment alone, and this is where he finds a surprising ally.
Christine Callaghan, Bertrand's girlfriend.
Right. Dixon attempts an early morning confession to Christine, whom he initially judged, superficially, as schoolmarmy and stiff.
Her reaction is not the shock or judgment he expected, it's immediate, pragmatic cooperation. She agrees to come up and look at the destruction.
And her solution is brilliant and tactical. She suggests remaking the bed with the extensive damage strategically placed at the foot. Her reasoning is that anyone inspecting the bed later won't connect it with smoking down there.
It's a low-effort, high-impact deception. And the conspiracy continues with the ultimate disposal of the evidence. Dixon hides the damaged bedside table in the junk room behind a screen.
He artfully arranges a still life of clutter. We're told specifically floppy hats, banjos, and a book called The Lesson of Spain to make the new arrangement look permanent and organic. This effort to integrate the evidence into the established chaos of the Welch household, it's a massive expenditure of energy, all for self-preservation.
And this successful conspiracy, built purely on mutual disdain for the Welches and a shared actionable secret, forges a deep and practical alliance between them. An alliance that is cemented at the disastrous ball, where Dixon executes the tactical abduction.
He's determined to escape the ball and the Welch's sphere of influence, so he decides to steal a ride. He targets the taxi reserved for Professor Barclay, the professor of music.
And the theft is audacious. Dixon manages to convince the driver he is Mr. Barclay. But the real genius is in what he does next. He instructs the driver to wait around the corner, creating a buffer zone between the taxi and the actual Barclays.
So when the real Barclays appear, Dixon engages them in conversation. He's listening carefully for the taxi's handbrake ratchet being released and the faint sound of the engine starting.
And then he casually discourages them from investigating the corner, pretending he's waiting for a friend who is late.
He manages the timing perfectly and escapes under the cover of polite conversation. And Christine, his accomplice, provides the perfect moral justification for it. She rationalizes the theft perfectly, saying getting a taxi for them was more important than getting one for the Barclays.
And this is the pivotal moment. It's where Dixon realizes this relationship with Christine, based on shared unethical behavior and direct, decisive action, is fundamentally liberating. It is the exact opposite of the toxic obligation he has with Margaret, which is built on his debilitating virtues. With Christine, they're united by a shared practical cynicism.
The emotional and professional pressure continues to build, though, leading us into Section 5, the climax of entanglements. The tension that has been quietly throttling Dixon finally breaks with Margaret in a confrontation that results in a shocking, memorable scene.
Dixon, fortified by the events of the ball and just tired of the cumulative weight of her emotional hold, witnesses Margaret flirting conspicuously with Gore or Kurt.
That's the last straw.
It is. He unleashes his fury, accusing her of exploiting the situation and effectively creating a scene.
And this triggers a profound hysterical fit in Margaret. Our sources describe it in excruciating detail. High-pitched, inward screams, deep moans, violent trembling and writhing on the bed. Dixon is completely paralyzed. He's unable to deal with this overwhelming theatrical emotional display. He just has no tools for this level of public meltdown.
And then comes the brutal but necessary intervention. Ex-Major Bill Atkinson, the insurance salesman who boards at Dixon's digs, enters the room.
Atkinson is a figure of decisive, non-academic action.
And he immediately administers a shocking but critically effective cure. The sources state that Atkinson instantly slaps Margaret very hard, shakes her vigorously, and forces neat Scotch whiskey down her throat.
And the effect is immediate.
It's immediate and absolute. The performance just stops. Margaret calms instantly, and Atkinson demands, "How do you feel now?" She stops trembling and apologizes to Dixon. It's a clinical, violent expulsion of the emotional drama she had cultivated.
This is an incredibly important scene for Dixon. It demonstrates that Margaret's manipulation is defeated not by rational argument, not by the intellectual truth of Catchpole's theory, and certainly not by gentle sympathy, which is Dixon's usual weak spot.
It is defeated only by aggressive, definitive action that completely refuses to play her game or give her the required audience for her performance. Dixon learns the only effective way to handle her crisis is complete and decisive refusal of the expected sympathy.
The lesson is learned, but the social nightmare isn't over. The Welches have their own score to settle. Dixon's subsequent attempt to call Christine, who is in London, is intercepted by Mrs. Welch herself.
And she immediately goes in for the kill. She asks directly about the burnt evidence. What you did to the sheet and blankets on your bed. The cover-up has been compromised.
Panicked, but incredibly fast, Dixon launches into a desperate, magnificent improvisation, the Chaos Campaign phone bluff.
He assumes a distorting O-mouth and an exaggerated professional voice, claiming to be the Evening Post speaking, and asks for Bertrand instead.
He needs to buy time and sow discord. And he successfully perpetrates a follow-up conversation with Bertrand, pretending to be a journalist gathering information about Bertrand's painting. And critically, he plants the seed that Christine was the source for the whole story, blaming her for betraying Bertrand's artistic secrets.
This brilliant, rapid thinking works perfectly to sow temporary discord between Bertrand and Christine. But the cost is immediate. Bertrand later confronts Dixon, revealing that Mrs. Welch was informed not by the bed damage itself, but by the fact that one of Dixon's so-called pals in this house told Mrs. Welch about Dixon's tea date with Christine.
And the pieces just click into place for Dixon. The informant is Johns, the silent mover and oboist we identified earlier. And Dixon immediately files away the news of this treachery for later pondering, realizing the social cost of his every move, even innocent tea dates, is being tallied by a hostile entity in the house.
Despite the high drama and still caught up in the emotional aftermath of Margaret's fit, Dixon tries to break things off with Christine. He's worried about the social and emotional complications Margaret represents. The guilt still holds a thread.
And this leads to Christine's unexpected honesty, a rare moment of genuine self-analysis and vulnerability that just cuts through all the pretense.
Christine admits that she looks starchy, a bit upstage, and sometimes talks like a governess, but she explains this exterior is a deliberate defense mechanism against the chaos around her.
She reveals she is only 20 next month and far less experienced than she looks. She seeks genuine, non-judgmental advice on her confusing relationship with Bertrand, who she describes as a queer mixture of kind and utterly unreasonable.
This is a moment of pure, honest exchange, a stark contrast to the performative conversations Dixon has been having for months, and Dixon's advice to her is crucial and revealing of his own hard-won wisdom.
He argues that love is actually the easy part. It's subjective, like liking green gages or rhubarb. It's just simple attraction. The truly hard part, he counsels, is the decision-making, deciding if you can stick the person you love enough to marry them.
Dixon is advising her to look past the surface attraction and assess the endurance required for a life with a person, especially in a toxic social system like the Welches. He is finally giving honest advice about real life and real commitment, defining compatibility not as shared passion, but as a shared tolerance for each other's flaws and the ability to endure.
This sets the stage for the ultimate resolution. Dixon has gained intellectual truth from Catchpole, formed a practical alliance with Christine, and found emotional clarity through Atkinson's intervention. So now we move to Section 6, the ultimate failure and the unlooked-for success.
Dixon attends the Sherry party before his big lecture feeling acutely unwell, but he is fortified by Sherry and Bill Atkinson's neat Scotch whiskey, which he snatched via Gore Urquhart. He is also sporting a magnificent black eye, a trophy from his recent social battles, which only adds to his surreal sense of internal chaos.
And the lecture itself, the one crucial academic performance required to solidify his position, is a catastrophic, unfiltered descent into chaos. Plagued by severe stage fright and fueled by this toxic mix of alcohol, anger, and anxiety, Dixon he loses his anchor.
He begins accidentally by imitating Welch's most annoying rhetorical phrases, of course, you see. Then he shifts in a panic to the principal's clipped, authoritative tone. He tries to recover, adopting an exaggerated northern accent in a desperate attempt to ground himself in some recognizable, perhaps working-class sincerity.
But the internal war between his anxiety, his anger, and his sadness just overwhelms him. He completely loses all control, switching wildly to an unnameable foreign accent and adopting a tone of sarcastic, wounding bitterness directed at the material and implicitly at the audience.
The resulting oratory is terrifying and spectacular. Our sources use an extraordinary analogy to describe the performance. They say he sounds like an unusually fanatical Nazi trooper reading out excerpts from a pamphlet written by a pacifist, Jewish literate communist.
That imagery, it just perfectly encapsulates the internal contradiction and the self-destructive explosion. It's the sound of his entire contained personality fracturing. The nihilist, the intellectual, the cynic, and the puppet all screaming at once.
It's a public, comprehensive explosion of the anarchic fury he had previously contained. He has finally projected the fraudulence of the academic culture he serves onto his own professional presentation. The lecture concludes with a loud roar of wordless voices and a collective feeling of shock in the room. And then Dixon passes out.
Concluding his academic career with a spectacular, non-negotiable failure, he's implicitly sacked. His tenure hopes are just extinguished in a drunken, rhetorical inferno.
But here is the massive counterintuitive twist. The ultimate failure leads directly to the ultimate escape route. Dixon receives a call from Gore Urquhart, the celebrity journalist, offering him a job in London.
And Gore Urquhart's rationale for hiring Dixon is perhaps the most shocking and liberating moment of the entire saga.
It really is. The job was originally intended for Bertrand, the bearded painter, but Gore Urquhart immediately disqualified him, stating, "I knew young Welch was no good as soon as I set eyes on him."
Which means Dixon's professional competence, or lack thereof, was totally irrelevant. Gore Urquhart delivers the kernel of knowledge that defines Dixon's entire journey. He says it directly.
Okay.
It's not that you've got the qualifications for this or any other work, but there are plenty who have. You haven't got the disqualifications, though, and that's much rarer.
Dixon was hired for what he wasn't. He lacked the capacity for sustained, deep pretense. He couldn't take himself seriously enough to survive a fraudulent system. And that very inability, that spectacular public rejection of the status quo, made him uniquely qualified for a real job outside of the academic bubble.
And the final pieces of freedom just fall into place so rapidly. Dixon is at the train station when he gets his last call from Christine. She has also fled the Welch's house after Bertrand took her for granted, confirming the instability of that entire family.
And she reveals that Carol Goldsmith, Cecil's wife, had also turned against Bertrand and the Welches, signifying a total collapse of their social influence. And because of the intellectual liberation granted by the catchpole theory, Dixon realizes he is finally, truly free from Margaret's manufactured guilt. The truth has finally translated into decisive action.
The final decision is clear. Dixon goes with Christine to London. He's seeking his new job and, crucially, a life where he can finally be of use to somebody, a purpose beyond monitoring Welch's memory and correcting proofs. He achieves freedom through chaos, failure, and alliances based on shared scorn for the professional status quo.
So if we synthesize Dixon's journey, we see him begin as a prisoner of his own politeness, trapped within an environment defined by false culture and mandated hierarchy. His anxiety and his deep cynicism, they weren't flaws. They were strangely necessary tools for navigating this world of profound social pretense.
And the key takeaway here, for you the learner, is that true knowledge, in a toxic social or professional environment, is less about mastering the curriculum, that perfect article, that prepared lecture, and far more about mastering the social landscape. You need to identify precisely who your genuine, action-oriented allies are.
The Christines, the decisive Atkinsons.
Right. And who the hidden, quiet informants are.
The Johns, absolutely. Dixon's failure to fit in, his inability to maintain the facade, that was what actually saved him. He learned that the only way to successfully reject toxic obligation is through spectacular, unambiguous action, even if that action involves burning a bed, stealing a taxi, or having a public nervous breakdown.
And most importantly, we learned that true success came not from achieving the expected qualifications, but from the lack of the opposite.
Gore Urquhart hired Dixon not for what he had, the academic qualifications, which were generic, but for what he lacked, the specific disqualifications of being a sustained, pretentious bore.
So we'll leave you with this provocative final thought to mull over. In your own professional life, what are your disqualifications? What is that unwillingness to play the social game, that commitment to spectacular failure, that inability to suffer fools gladly, or that refusal to engage in petty professional pretense? Could those very traits, which currently feel like liabilities in a rigid system, ultimately prove to be the most valuable assets for your true advancement and personal freedom?
Something to explore in your own deep dive. We'll talk again soon.